name is Kay Ward. And during the war years, I grew up in Claremore, Oklahoma. Now, my dad was with the Atomic Energy Commission, and so he had to travel all over the country. My mother had a victory garden. I can remember it was fun to run in and among the asparagus. And the other crop that was an absolute one we had to have was okra. I still love okra, and it isn't so available in this part of the country, but okra and asparagus were two crops I remember from my mother's victory garden. But the story is really about my Uncle Johnny. Uncle Johnny was going to have a victory garden, and he was an extremely fastidious man. He dressed in his suits all the time. His bow tie was perfect. Everything about him, his hands, everything was fastidious. And anything that he did with an exacting care. And he dug up his victory garden in the backyard in a good sunny spot. Then he raked it, and he raked it one direction and then another direction and another direction. So the soil was loose and beautiful. There wasn't a lump in it. And it was this beautifully prepared soil. Then he added chicken manure because he thought that would be the best. Then he planted his seeds. And the seeds, of course, responded to this beautiful soil and came leaping up, bright green and pretty, until they curled up and died. He had over-fertilized and he burnt the plants up. We never let him forget that.
My name is Dobby Weigert. I was born in my family's home in Nakata, Washington in March of 1931. We always had a vegetable garden along with one or two milk cows, a pig, chickens, dogs and cats, ducks, and usually one or two beef cattle. Everyone in the family pitched in, my father, my mother, my two sisters, and myself. After World War II began, families were encouraged to have victory gardens to help with the war effort. As a result of my victory garden experience, I'm still raising a garden. I'm now 92 years old, and last year we produced enough Marion berries for 264 pies, and we produced 1,500 zucchinis off 50 zucchini plants.
My name is John Fesh, and before I was born, my family lived in Illinois. During that time, my dad and my uncle were serving our country in the U.S. Army. While they were overseas, all of my relatives grew vegetables and flowers in their backyard gardens. Many years after the war was over and my dad had returned home safely, I asked him about his experiences. He politely declined. He just didn't want to talk about it. So I turned to my mother. When I asked my mom if she would tell me about the wartime days from her perspective, she mostly talked about the family gardens. It always seemed to me that those victory gardens had three purposes. Obviously, they provided fresh produce when supplies were scarce. In order to support the troops, we made many sacrifices. It seemed like a lot of most everything went to the war effort: food and clothes, fuel, and lots of other very important everyday supplies. We suffered a little bit as a result, but nothing like our troops did. They were the ones seeing the bombs go off and fighting to protect our freedoms here at home. We really didn't mind making the sacrifice because we shared in it for the good of the country. Also, those gardens lifted our spirits. Seeing the green vegetable plants and the pretty flowers, such as the iris and the lilacs and the columbine, just made you feel better, especially after hearing Paul Harvey on the radio with war reports and words like, "sad day today, 30 troops were killed when..." And in a very real sense, they gave us something to do to help us keep our minds off of things such as our husbands and sons being in harm's way. You just kept planting, picking, and pruning, and it took your mind off of what might be going on in Europe and Africa.
I'm Fred Fraker. My parents were raised in a farming village in what is now the Republic of Slovakia. But here in America, in a steel town near Pittsburgh, There was no room for a garden around the barrack-style housing project where we lived during World War II. So when a local church, St. Joseph's, offered victory garden plots in their cemetery, my parents jumped at the opportunity. Of course, we didn't dig over the graves of the residents. It was kind of a social hour of meeting neighbors while you worked in the garden. Of course, all we did was play around and maybe pick a weed or two or something. Um, as little kids, you were cognizant of the fact, even as children, that there was a war going on, and so the victory garden was part of it. The best part was after my mother had canned the harvest. My little sister and I hitched up our red wagon with the surplus vegetables and sold them to the neighbors. So we take our little uh, wagon, and so we had mainly, carrots and tomatoes and beets and peas and beans, that sort of a thing. And it was a nickel maybe for a couple of carrots or a bunch of carrots. In those days, you could buy a lot of candy and chewing gum with the pennies and nickels we earned. After the war, my father saved enough as a steel worker to build his dream home with a beautiful garden in the backyard that we enjoyed for many years.
Hi, I'm Mark Peterson, and before he died, my friend Niall Stevens told me this story about victory gardens. I was born in 1943 in Montpelier, Idaho. It wasn't until after World War II that I first became aware of the term victory garden, but I well remember my grandparents' gardens from those days, even though I didn't know the name, and they probably didn't call it that. To them, it was just the garden. Grandpa, a conductor on the Union Pacific Railroad, was responsible for the vegetables. He grew just about every vegetable you could think of, but my favorites were the carrots, which I was allowed to dig and eat right there in the garden, with the dirt rubbed off on my Levi's. They also had chickens and a cow that I never got the hang of milking. My grandmother took care of the flowers. Peonies and lilacs were the ones always in bloom in time to be taken to the cemetery on Decoration Day, what we now call Memorial Day. I'm sure I inherited gardening genes from that side of the family. After that, wherever Niall lived, he tried to have a garden. And before he died, he was trying to have a garden in pots in a very small area off the kitchen. He called it his experiment and said some were successful and some were a bust.
My name is Nancy Lee Adams Draper. In the early years of World War II, we were living in Kelowna, Iowa. It was a wonderful place to grow up. Kelowna was surrounded by old order Amish farms, and they are the best gardeners in the whole world. And every family in town or in the country had a victory garden. It was a badge of patriotism. I don't recall a single home without one. Our mothers would talk over the fences, mostly about their garden successes. Seeds were shared, and bragging abounded. Today, I remember those gardens as a place of patriotic pride, primarily by women doing their duty on the home front. And we lived on one corner, and a lady named Grandma Camp lived on the other. She wasn't our grandma, but she made cookies, and we thought of her as a grandma. And in between was this huge garden of mothers. And my father was in the service. So Sally and I were the ones who would gather what mother had planted. I was known for corn and beans and peas and tomatoes and And they always seemed sweeter than they do today. Even though Dad was gone, it was a serene time for our family, even without him. And we would we had a lot of produce, and we just put it in buckets on the porch, and people would come, and maybe we didn't have something that they had, and we'd share. It was really nice. I think we knew we were helping Mom, and we were proud. We were really proud that we had a big garden, and it not only fed our family, but other people, particularly older people, like Grandma Kemp on the other corner. We would take her lots of things, always. Maybe that's why we got cookies.